With that, I commend this bill to the House. Thank you.
James Shaw, Madam Speaker.
I do apologise.
I have days like that too, Madam Speaker.
I call the Honourable James Shaw.
Honestly, there are days when I struggle to remember my own name, so that's fair enough. Madam Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise on this bill, the Taxation, Neutralising Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Bill as well, which the Green Party also supports. I just wanted to start with just a bit of a discussion about the history of this bill and the history that led into this bill in reference to some of the points that were made by Barbara Kuriger and Stephen Joyce about the pace at which it had been introduced, because it was actually in the year 2013 that Inland Revenue officials first started flagging to both the Ministers of Finance and Revenue that multinationals are avoiding paying tax by profit shifting, and that work to protect the New Zealand tax base was actually quite an urgent and ought to be a key area of focus for tax policy over the course of the 18 months from when they started raising that flag. And of course, that was prior to the 2014 general election, and then it took another few years before actually the New Zealand Herald reporter Max Nippert got some explosive headlines, and along with some other great investigative reporters as well, which exposed the extent of the potential tax evasion which was at stake. And so, as I understand it, as I remember it, the Herald's analysis then showed that foreign multinationals could be avoiding as much as $500 million a year in tax take, which my office's calculation is enough for about 9,259 nurses, 7,601 police, 10,498 primary school teachers. And so in December of that year, 2016, the then national government decided that perhaps it was time to do something about this. And so when members of New Zealand First and the Labour Party and the Green Party referred to the sluggish pace of reform, that is essentially what we were referring to, the fact that it took 3 years and some fairly explosive investigative reporting to actually get the then government to do something about it. Madam Speaker, the problem has been discussed in a number of speeches already on this bill and in various other debates and in the media in this House, but it is worth noting that in New Zealand, for example, there are about $4.2 billion worth of sales to the Apple company, but they pay virtually no tax. Google booked something like $14.9 million of revenue at a cost of goods charge of 97% of their revenue, which meant that their profits before tax were merely just over half $500,000 and a tax bill of $361,000 on revenues of $14.9 million. And so when you look at those kinds of numbers, you have to say that while these companies are obeying the law, and they've got very good accountants and lawyers to make sure that they do obey the law, that therefore the question has to be asked, is the law adequate? It clearly isn't. And particularly when those companies are competing with New Zealand service providers and companies who actually do have to pay tax because they aren't, New Zealand residents. They don't have anywhere to shift their profits to. So this is an important bill in terms of starting to try and recoup some of that base. I mentioned that the Herald had said that they thought that the estimates of lost revenues were about $500 million. Professor Craig Elliff, a tax expert, told National Radio that he thought it could be as much as $1 billion. And a UK-based organisation, the Tax Justice Network, found earlier this year that the likely losses were about $700 million. And when the government introduced this in Budget 2017, they thought that the changes that are outlined in this legislation would recover something along the lines of $100 million a year. So the amounts that we're talking about, there's like some pretty huge variances in both what we think lost revenues may be, and also the amount that may be recoverable through changes like the ones that are outlined in this bill. But having said that, and I know that some of the criticisms about this in the past have been, well, no one really seems to be able to put a hard number on it, or we can't agree on a hard number about it, that actually that shouldn't stop us from rolling forward, because even at the low end, at $100 million, that's still a lot of teachers and nurses and doctors that would pay for. But if it is as high as the high-end estimates of Professor Craig Elliff, well, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and sooner or later you're talking about real money. So the bill does a number of things which should prevent multinational companies from using high interest rates on loans between their external to New Zealand bodies to New Zealand bodies. And so just to be clear about what that means, it does seem that some multinational companies, one of the facilities that they are able to legally use is that in order to help finance in either expansion or products and services into New Zealand, that they provide the New Zealand operator with a loan, and then they charge themselves, essentially the New Zealand operation, an extremely high interest rate on that loan, meaning that then subtracts from the profitability of the New Zealand operation, meaning that it doesn't have to pay as much tax, but the cash, of course, gets retained in the parent body. And that is, frankly, a rort. It might be legal, but it shouldn't be. And so one of the really good things about this particular bill is it really helps to start to constrain that kind of activity. Another one, of course, and this is increasingly true in the internet age and with e-commerce, is that it is pretty easy for multinational companies to actually have very large presences in New Zealand in terms of bookable revenue. The kind of internet companies like Google and others are the obvious ones, where they're selling services into New Zealand at many tens or hundreds or more of millions of dollars. But they don't actually have a physical, permanent presence in this country. And so then it does become difficult to be able to say, well, if that revenue is gathered here, what is the tax take on it if the company isn't technically operating here, even though they've got hundreds of millions of dollars worth of sales? So having a permanent establishment is one of the measures that this bill goes to. Transfer pricing received a lot of coverage during that sort of media storm that kind of led to the introduction of this bill, where companies are able to shift profits into offshore companies at a lower rate, where it's taxed at a much lower rate in a manner that doesn't reflect the actual kind of economic activities that are taking place here in New Zealand. And a number of people who are interested in this kind of thing will remember, of course, recently that the European Union has forced Ireland to set up accounts because it believes that it has been essentially subsidising multinational companies based in Ireland, where they should have been paying tax elsewhere, and it's saying, actually, no, you need to be taxing them at a reasonable rate. And then, of course, the fourth thing that this bill does is to cut down on the ability of multinational companies to exploit the differences between different jurisdictions' tax regimes in order to get an advantageous tax position through hybrid and branch mismatches. So these are all moves that we have that in opposition, when the Green Party was in opposition, that we supported. There are a number of other things that we felt that other jurisdictions, particularly the United Kingdom and Australia, had introduced that looked pretty successful, that we think ought to be considered, and we'll be hoping at Select Committee to be able to advance some of those other things. But one of the I guess one of the things we should never look a gift horse in the mouth, that when we finally do get some progress on something that we've been campaigning on for a number of years, even if it doesn't go as far as we'd like, we think that actually the measures in here are all pretty sensible, very well thought through by officials, do match what a number of other jurisdictions around the world are doing, and we want to encourage those. And I do want to note that one of New Zealand's leading tax experts, Andrea Black, has said that these are pretty good, that it's not a full-blown diverted profit tax, but it is a sensible step in the right direction. And on that basis, we commend this bill to the House.
I call Andrew Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.